Okay, it's quite a long film. I think none of us expected it to be 2 hours long. So, actually, maybe we should have some house lights up, because I think otherwise people are going to feel quite sleepy. Yeah, I don't need to be shrouded in gloom. I can see my notes a little bit better. I'm going to keep my comments fairly brief, because we have been here for 2 hours already, and I'd obviously like people's comments. But it's quite clear from the film itself that it's very much about the idea of Latin America as a region. And as a Latin American specialist, I always start my lectures with this thought, that there are no other regions of the world that you could consider to have such an historical and cultural coherence. So although the idea of Latin America wasn't actually invented until the 19th century, and even then Brazil didn't really think it was Latin America because it wasn't Spanish in its colonial history, what you've got is a region with a remarkable shared history since 1492. You have only two colonizing nations, Spain and Portugal. You have a shared linguistic and cultural heritage from that Iberian experience. You have very similar legal structures throughout the region. You have a similar religious experience with the Catholic Church. And although there are many, many differences as well that we could talk about, clearly that colonizing experience, the experience of being regarded as a place for the extraction of wealth, the marginalization first and slaughter, first of all, of indigenous peoples, and then of course the massive importation into particular parts of the region of African slaves, means that there is a narrative that Latin America can tell itself. And this long debate goes right back to the period of independence at the beginning of the 19th century, when in a period of 10 years, most of the countries in the region threw off the colonial shackles, mainly of Spain. Brazil was a slightly different case, and began to debate amongst themselves, who are we? What are we about? What is our trajectory? What is it to be developed? Where do we look? Do we look to Europe, because we were colonized by Europe, or do we look to what the Mexicans call the Colossus of the North, to the United States? And of course we know that by the beginnings of the 20th century, the mid of the 20th century, the American influence was extremely powerful, but it had already been articulated at the very point that Latin America threw off colonial rule. The minute the Spanish left, Monroe Doctrine was declared by the United States, which basically said, this is our hemispheric sphere of influence. Everybody else can keep out. And that, of course, has been the source of a hemispheric struggle, both a north-south struggle, but also in relationship to other kind of Western influences. And I think this idea that Latin America has constantly tried to come up with its own projects, and it's had ideological battles right since the 19th century. Where did liberalism took root in Latin America in the mid-19th century? It was a liberalism that basically accepted, we will export raw materials to Europe, first of all, and then to the United States, in exchange for manufactured goods. That's the relationship. It's our comparative advantage, it's what we have to do. But it wasn't very long until the peoples of the region realised that this was a pretty bad deal, and that the political and economic exclusion of very large numbers of, first of all, indigenous people, but also the imported slaves and other poor inhabitants of the region, began to show up the cracks in this model very, very quickly. By the time you get to the early 20th century and you've got immigrants flooding into places like Argentina, they're bringing with them new ideologies, anarchism, socialism, even fascism from Western Europe. And there are pitched battles on the streets of the main capitals of Latin America because there are such profound disagreements about how the politics of these countries should be run, how representation was to occur, what democracy should look like, what growth should look like, and essentially what distribution and human welfare should look like. And Latin America has been through most of the variants that you could think of. It's been through socialist revolutions. And by the way, most of what we think of as socialist revolution is actually nationalism. There's an incredibly strong sense of nationalism in Latin America, partly because the nation states were formed very early on in the 19th century, and of course also of regionalism, which I'm going to come to in a second. So you had socialist experiments, you've had Cuba, you've had Nicaragua, you've got Chavez in Venezuela at the moment, which are well cited in this film. You've had, if not fascism, you've had extremely right-wing military dictatorships. You've had populism, which managed to combine sort of developmentalism with military dictatorships. And actually, for many other countries in the South, Latin America is a point of reference. We started off with the World Social Forum. The strength of social movements in Latin America is notable. Sometimes they've been co-opted by the states, sometimes they've almost been created by the states before breaking through, sometimes they've been suppressed by the state. But the emergence of independent trade unions, of all kinds of social movements, and most notably recently indigenous movements, of human rights movements, for example in Argentina, which were hugely important in some of the most recent human rights conventions of recent decades. These are powerful forces. The Catholic Church clearly was part of that process, although not in every country. In some countries, like Argentina, it was extremely right-wing and repressive. In others, it was the cradle of many of these social movements. So Latin America has this ability to contest constantly. What is it that we're doing? Who are we? What is the development path that we want to have? And back in 2000, when the Centre for Brazilian Studies had just been set up at the University of Oxford, I noticed that they were inviting Lula to speak. This was when everybody thought he was in the wilderness. This man will never be elected. He's contested 3 elections and he's lost them all. He's a man out of time. The idea of, social justice in Latin America, no, it's not going to happen. And clearly this film has shown that events have turned out rather differently in the last decade. So there was Lula and his entourage from the Workers' Party, and they had omitted to book an interpreter for Lula, who does not speak English. He's a metal worker and originally from the northeast of Brazil, and as you could tell from the film, a very humble man. So I offered my services. So I ended up in a seminar with lots of Oxford academics sitting next to Lula interpreting for him. And of course he had the last word. And he gives speeches like a trade unionist would, with fingers in the air and sort of poking the air. And his final phrase was this: "O problema com a elite brasileira que eles têm os olhos voltados para a Europa e a bunda para o Brasil." And those who understood Portuguese began to giggle slightly because I had to interpret this. So what he said was, the problem with Brazil is that the elites have got their eyes turned towards Europe and their arse towards Brazil. And at that point I thought, okay, I'll never get a job here, because I just said arse in front of all my professors. But that's the point, is like, where is the development model coming from? And the other really important part of this film, I think, is about regionalism and the way in which Latin America has begun to say no, both to European models of development and particularly to the influence of the United States. Now, the Organization of American States has been in existence for the last 60 years, but it is dominated by the USA. And with that realization, Latin America has begun to reinvent new forms of collectivity, new formations. UNASUR, the Commission of Latin American and Caribbean States, basically any kind of continental formation that is not dominated by US power or indeed by Europe. And I've just come back from Colombia, where they're beginning a peace process, and it is notable that Cuba and Venezuela have been chosen as the 2 friends of Colombia in this peace process. And Latin America has tried for several years now, decades, to sort out its own internal problems with democracy, with coups, even with natural disasters, with peacekeeping missions, for example, in Haiti. So there's a new sense of unity and purpose, and even when the countries in the region disagree, because let's not pretend from this film that, all of Latin America is now contesting neoliberalism. That is not the case, okay? So I would be a little bit wary of lumping together all of the governments all of the presidents that were cited as being part of the pink tide. Clearly you have Chavez or Morales on one end of the spectrum, and a much, much more polite, you know, neoliberalism with a human face, perhaps in places like Chile, for example. But this sense that Latin America is an entity, a relatively homogeneous entity with common problems, common histories, and therefore can come up with its own solutions, thank you very much, even to an intractable problem such as 50 years of civil war in Colombia, I think is extremely important. And so we are at a very interesting and new point in that regard. The other point I think that is made about where this new left or this new confidence is taking Latin America is the growth model, the growth versus equity problem. And we can see that countries like Brazil, in fact most of Latin America, is still in the dependency trap that was identified actually well in the beginning of the 20th century and named as such, and was probably even identified in the 19th century. The fact is that the region still depends on its exports for agricultural goods like soya, or palm oil, or sugar, or other commodities for biofuels, which of course has been a disaster in many regions of the world, and for mineral wealth. And whether that's tin, whether that's oil, that still leaves you pretty dependent. Another point I wanted to make about Latin America, for those unfamiliar, is that, you know, Latin America was, again, the first region that articulated the problem with this dependency back in the beginnings in the middle of the 20th century, that they noticed that they couldn't ever catch up with the developed countries of the north because of the terms of trade. Because you'd always get, at least for agricultural products, an ever-declining amount of revenue, whilst the manufacturers coming from outside would always increase in price. So this issue of how to break that dependency, given these globalized relations, again, they're not new. Yeah, again, we go back to the 19th century. You have to work with multinationals. You can't not trade. You can't not borrow money. You can't not service your debt, unfortunately, as Peru discovered in the 1980s. So how do you then retreat to some, at least, security and equity? And I think the big issue in the film was about land. And we noticed, you know, the question of the Amazon and the idea of the global commons, the idea that the international community should actually just pay Ecuador not to dig up its oil, not to damage the Amazon, and not to affect its indigenous reserves. The idea of land as a right, the idea of collective rights, again, hugely important. We saw the MST, the landless workers movement. And in Colombia at the moment, what was the driver of that conflict for 50 years? It was land, yeah? And in that you have involved the paramilitaries, you have oil companies, you have big ranchers and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, if the current government has instituted a land reform that should work out before and while the peace negotiations are in process. Why? Because if you don't solve the structural problem, there will be no peace in Colombia. So this question of sort of equity and fairness is pretty important. And I think probably the last point, because I know I wanted to ask some questions and just get the conversation going. But not only is Latin America questioning, and has done for several decades, for a long time, its economic dependence and its inability thus to distribute to its own people and to guarantee them fair standards of living. But you also have a democratic question, yeah? And as much as Latin America has experimented with different economic models, it has political models as well. This is new. The idea that in Bolivia and Ecuador that you have multicultural, pluri-ethnic societies, it's written into the constitution, it's written into the forms of representation, it's guaranteed in the constitutional assemblies. You have an indigenous leader, an indigenous party in power in Bolivia. This is new. Chavez is not white. He represents an entirely different class of people. Lula equally came from a trade union base and represented, and in fact has been re-elected, was re-elected by an enormous number of people have been excluded entirely from the social system because he had granted every family with children a basic income to look after them. So there is something very interesting going on. You've had the first clutch 5 women presidents as well in the region. There is a shift going on. I wouldn't say that all the countries are shifting at the same rate. They're involved in the global economy in very different ways. But again, to return to this opening point, the notion of Latin America as itself, the ability to see itself, to discuss itself, to debate amongst itself, to copy good ideas when their neighbours do it, to collaborate, to question orthodoxies, to renationalise industries on which they're dependent when necessary. This is new, and it makes it an incredibly interesting region to look at as a middle-income region that has a very coherent and interesting political statement to make to the world at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. In the light of your personal expertise on this subject, could you guide us through the labyrinth, the quagmire, if you wish, the debacle is the proper word, of what's happening worldwide on an international scale? Who do you think are the best people to decide the way forward? Is it North America? Or is it the US? Or should, as the film suggests, should it be incumbent upon the different nations of Latin America to decide their own future? And in the process, if you could enlighten us about your view on general globalization. Thank you.
Blimey, that's a small question. One of the most important things I think is not only that Latin America has organised itself with its own conversation, but the dialogue South-South is hugely important, and Brazil has been one of the leaders in that, working with African, Middle Eastern countries and others, and Latin America has staked out some quite distinctive positions on things like, for example, the responsibility to protect, i.e. the terms and conditions on which we go in and invade other countries allegedly to protect their populations. And Latin America is very careful to protect the sovereignty of other countries and to make sure that there genuinely is an international mandate and that the test is properly conducted as to whether this meets international norms. The fact that Brazil, for example, would like a seat on the UN Security Council, I'm sure there are other similarly up-and-coming countries, the BRICS countries, who would like that. I think if Latin America can achieve a reform of the UN system, the Security Council system, then there will be a much wider range of voices that will decide on these global issues. And again, the clout of some Latin American countries, principally Brazil, has been able to say no to the FTAA, it said no to the WTO, and actually been able to put their foot down in a way that some countries in other regions are not in a position to do because they simply don't have the size of economy or the state capacity or the purchase within diplomatic circles. So the USA, that had been predominant in many areas, has actually been put on the back foot. And I think this will continue. Other questions?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Macaulay. My name is Luciana, and I'm from Argentina. And I really enjoyed this documentary, but throughout the documentary, I started thinking about my country, my home country, and Venezuela. And the question that surfaced was, right now we're going through somewhat of a democratic crisis. I think you could say that, put it generously. So do neoliberal challenges have to come at the expense of democratic governance? Does democratic governance have to be undermined when challenging neoliberal policies?
Is this on? Not sure if it's on or not. Yes? Okay. No, I don't think so. There is a similar problem in Bolivia at the moment, and it's a problem of governability, essentially. We tend to think of democratic governance as having a particular form, and often that's, a two-party system, nice and neat and tidy. You know, you vote every 4 years with very little participatory structures beneath that. So the problem both for Venezuela and for Bolivia is how to govern and redistribute whilst attempting some kind of decentralization of decision-making power down to the grassroots. And what that ends up often doing is bypassing some of the institutions. So what we seem to have a problem with institutionalizing the mechanisms of representation and of participation, which of course is what makes, you know, the Liberal Democratic critics of those two governments very, very anxious. I don't think there's necessarily a trade-off, but I think that we're in a bit of a transition period. There are even some who are talking about kind of post-liberal politics, i.e. that there will be a renegotiation of what it means to properly represent and properly participate.
You knew about